Hi all, my name is Steve Bromage, the Executive Director of Maine Historical Society. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. We are deeply appreciative to Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. for his willingness to take the time out of his busy schedule, which is very busy towards the end of the semester here, to be with us this evening. This will be an important and I think challenging program. Dr. Glaude's most recent book, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Own, helped and inspire and inform Maine Historical Society's upcoming exhibition, which is similarly titled Begin Again, Reckoning with Intolerance in Maine, which, as Kathleen said, will open in our gallery just next week, May 27th. I hadn't realized how soon it was. Our exhibit, Begin Again, is curated by community members Darren Ranko, Crystal Williams, Ann Glass, and MHS's Tilly Lasky, who has done a great job on all of our recent exhibitions. The exhibit and accompanying program series explores Maine's historic role in structures of race and privilege and how Maine fits into this national dialogue about race that has exploded in such powerful ways this past year. That initiative seeks to provide information, context, and really a place to reflect and challenge one's own understanding and assumptions about Maine, ourselves, and how we all fit into this really critical national dialogue we're in the midst of. I invite you to read the blog on our website to learn more about the exhibit and the approach the curators took. We also had a wonderful panel last week where the curators got together and shared kind of insights into their process and what's there. I think it's a really powerful kind of introduction to the themes and topic. Our speaker tonight has been a really important leader in helping our nation understand and come to terms with these really critical issues. So again, we're really appreciative for his time. Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. is an intellectual who speaks to the complex dynamics of the American experience. He holds a master's degree in African American Studies from Temple University and a PhD in religion from Princeton. He began his teaching career here at Maine in Bowdoin, so he has some local knowledge. His most well-known books take a wide look at Black communities, the difficulties of race in the United States, and the challenges our democracy faces. So he's been looking at these issues very closely for many years and has some great perspective. He's currently the James McDonald Distinguished University Professor and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He's also a columnist for Time Magazine, an MSNBC contributor, and regularly appears on Meet the Press. Dr. Glaude, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Steve, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. It's a delight to be with you all. I wish I was there. It would be nice to have some blueberry muffins and some good chowder, as it were. I remember fondly Bowdoin was the place that I began my career, and it was such a wonderful time. I can remember my son learning how to ride a bike. I can remember St. Paul's. I can remember all the places that were so important in those formative years. So thank you so much. I want to also thank Kathleen for her work, working with Dion, my assistant, and all of the people behind the scenes, the invisible labor that makes this possible. You know, we have to lift up those folks who make our lives possible, make our lives easier. So I want to thank you all who are making this webinar work, because whenever I get near technology, there's always this chance that it will all collapse. So I want to thank Maine Historical Society for taking up, in some ways, the call that animates Begin Again. And it's in that vein that I want to offer a few remarks, and then hopefully we can have a wonderful conversation. I'm going to try to offer a broad framing, not so much about Maine in particular, but about the United States, and then we can have a more directed conversation. You know, we find ourselves, and there is no reasonable way to deny this, at least in my view, in a moment of profound transition. America is changing, and the substance of that transformation isn't quite clear, at least to me it isn't. Who we will be as a nation has yet to come into view. But what remains are the shards of what has been shattered. People cleave to old ideas and, in some ways, to their illusions. And many of us cut ourselves against the sharp edges of their passions. A week or so ago, the family of Andrew Brown Jr., buried him in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. Some people are saying that the sound is static. I hope I'm being clear. So I'll read this sentence again. A week or so ago, the family of Andrew Brown Jr. Buried him in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. It was a heart-wrenching ritual of Black grief. Another family weeping the loss of a loved one at the hands of the police. Its death, along with Ma'Khia Bryant's and the recently released footage of Louisiana state troopers brutally killing Ronald Green, has intensified the reckoning we now face. This sense that our way of life is undergoing a substantive shift. Now, although it feels, at least to me, like a lifetime ago, on April 20th, we witnessed something that I honestly was not expecting. A jury held Derek Chauvin guilty on all three accounts for the murder of George Floyd. And just next week, we will be commemorating the anniversary, the first year anniversary of his death. I was stunned, I must admit, because of what can be called a kind of earned skepticism. I did not believe that the courts would hold a police officer accountable for the death of a Black person in this instance. Our lives, the evidence has suggested, do not matter in this way. But Chauvin was convicted, was cuffed, and walked out of that courtroom. I imagined ghosts dancing around, the chairs there. In some ways, the verdict signaled the beginning of a possible shift in how we might think about policing in this country. Minimally, it let police officers know that they cannot act with impunity as if they are above the law. The verdict potentially, at least, disrupts decades of policing shaped by the ideological framing of law and order, or the war on drugs, or being tough on crime, views fueled by assumptions about the inherent criminality of communities of color. Assumptions that rationalize, in some ways, the militarization of the police, justified the incarceration of millions of our fellows, and placed violence, in some ways, at the core of policing of particular Americans in this country. Now, the juror's decision in this case did not resolve the problem of policing in America, but that decision, in my view, only sets the stage for what we do next. So we are changing, that much is clear. But then even with regards to policing, we're changing. But then, of course, Ma'Khia Bryant, no matter what you think of the substance of the act, but Ma'Khia Bryant, Adam Toledo, Andrew Brown Jr., Mario Gonzalez, Ronald Green, all of that happened. And as James Baldwin put it, quote, "The horror is that America changes all the time without ever changing at all," end quote. In some ways, as Baldwin says, we're still governed by the slave codes, and the point is deliberately provocative. He's not suggesting here that Black people are still slaves or that the police are slave catchers. Rather, he dramatizes what is at the heart of policing in this country, that some people are valued more than others, while others are treated with a generalized sense of disregard. That valuation, especially in the hands of police, can be lethal, has been lethal, continues to be lethal. In many ways, what we have witnessed over the last few months, the insurrection on January 6th, the spate of voting laws aimed to disenfranchise Americans, the violent assault against Asian Americans, the debate around immigration, all of this has in some ways been a panic about the changing nature of the country. There are those who cling to the idea that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe, that some among us, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more, that these people have a different sense of possession of the country, while the rest of us should shut up and be grateful. It is an idea as old as the Republic. It is the serpent that has threatened to swallow this fragile experiment whole every generation. And any serious or sincere grappling with who we will be, who we will become as a nation, must confront this serpent in the garden. We must admit, and if we don't admit it, we do so at our peril, that racial inequality in America is not the result of random events. Ours is the country we have made. Racial inequality is not the result of a collection of bad choices on the part of various individuals. It is the consequence of policy decisions, of deliberate efforts to build a society that instantiates what I've called the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others. Think about the policies of the New Deal. Black folks systematically locked out by Southern Democrats. Think about the benefits of the GI Bill. Black veterans who fought for freedom across Europe locked out because of systematic racism that barred them from accessing those benefits. A dual housing market, a dual labor market, a residential segregation, banking policy, segregated schools. These were deliberate policies. And even though they're poor white Americans who may argue that they have no privilege at all, but the one thing that they do not have to worry about is being denied access to privilege because they're Black. Racial inequality isn't the result of random events. It is the consequence of deliberate choices with accumulated benefit. And if I'm right, and I think the historical evidence is clear, and I think Maine Historical Society is trying to tell a different story with the history, as it were. The only way we are going to remedy racial inequality in this country is to admit that we created it. That we created it. We are the serpents in the garden. And if we created it, we have to be just as deliberate in getting rid of it. To echo Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here, we will have to engage in a revolution of value. We will have to commit ourselves to building a country that affirms the dignity and sacrality of every human being, no matter the color of their skin, no matter their zip code or where they're from, who they love, their gender or their ability. It will involve finally uprooting the idea that some among us, because of the color of their skin, ought to be valued more than others. Now, this is hard work. I'll admit it. We have to tell ourselves the truth about what we've done and who we are. This is why this exhibit is so important, right? The truth, or better, acceptance, becomes the basis for a different way of being together. But it's hard to tell ourselves the truth about who we are. We would rather affirm our goodness, safety, and comfort are found there. But in doing so, we remain, as William James said, permanently docked at the station, doing the same thing over and over again, wash, rinse, and repeat. I'm reminded of the No Chance Saloon and Eugene O'Neill's Iceman Cometh, yes? People give voice to their dreams, but to sit there and drown their sorrows and failures and drink. Think for a moment about Senator Tim Scott's response to President Biden. He insisted that America was not a racist country. And Vice President Harris, although she acknowledged our history of racism, agreed with Senator Scott. She said, America is not a racist country. Now, I could easily marshal the evidence to prove otherwise. I could give you examples of systemic racism that affect the distribution of advantage and disadvantage in this country. I could point out that we are only 56 years removed from the passage of the Voting Rights Act, reminding you of the late political theorist Judith Sklar, who said America didn't become a truly, genuinely multiracial democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But that won't get us to the heart of the matter, it seems to me. None of it would. We have to ask ourselves instead the question, why did Senator Scott and why do others make this claim in the first place? Why the declaration that America is not racist? Why now? Well, I think at first it seems to me it aims to limit the scope of our attempts to remedy present racial inequality. We tell ourselves that we're not racist so that we don't try to, in some ways, address what's at the heart of the matter. It lets us know that the wild claims about systemic racism in policing and housing and the like are part of an effort to shake down the nation, as the argument goes, by a band of race hustlers. We have trouble, the argument goes, but we are not racist. It's a variant of those familiar utterances. I'm not a racist, but this doesn't make me a racist, but in another sense, these statements work as a kind of absolution of our sins that maintain our innocence. We tell ourselves the lie about who we are because we don't want to admit what we've done and what is required of us to repair it all. But if we are going to come through this moment really transformed, if we are finally to get out of history's ass pocket, we're going to have to uproot the value gap. We're going to have to tell ourselves the truth. This is what makes this exhibit so important. We cannot tell ourselves this story of American virtue that secures our innocence. In fact, James Baldwin insisted that the country confront the lie that sustains its innocence. And fire next time, he said, it is the innocence that constitutes the crime. Baldwin relentlessly exposed the lies that America told itself. In an essay published in 1965 entitled Nothing Personal, he said this, quote, "We are afraid to reveal ourselves because we trust ourselves so little. And in this labyrinth, the person is desperately trying not to find out what he really thinks. Therefore, the truth cannot be told, even about one's attitudes. We live by lies," Baldwin said. He goes on to say that, and not only, for example, about race, whatever by this time in this country or indeed in the world this word may mean, but about our very natures. The lie has penetrated our most private moments and the most secret chambers of our heart, end quote. America has never been a beacon of virtue. It is not an example of democracy achieved, nor is this country the shining city on the hill. And to admit that is not to, in some ways, diminish the power of the experiment. It's just simply to tell the truth about our failures. We tell ourselves these stories in order to protect ourselves from what we've done. And I want to suggest that our problems in the United States go beyond who occupies the White House or the latest example of American racism. We have to get to the rot at the heart of the matter, to tap the root. And this requires, in my view, that we deconstruct the stories we tell ourselves, that we deconstruct in so many ways the stories that we often hold sacred, that we tell the truth so that we might release ourselves into a different way of being in the world. Americans are trapped in a history we refuse to know but carry within us. The terrors and panic we experience have everything to do with the gap between who we imagine ourselves to be and who deep down we really are. And that the nation actively evades confronting this gap locks the country into a kind of perpetual adolescence where those who desperately hold on to the American myth as some kind of new world Eden refuse to grow up. Can you imagine being stuck forever in Never Never Land? Forever lost boys and lost girls refusing to be responsible, refusing to be held accountable? I can't help but connect this insight to what I've witnessed over the last 5 years or so. Americans who refuse to grow up revel in the fantasy that ours must remain a white nation in the vein of old Europe. You had one of those children as your governor, Governor LePage, right? When I was in Maine, it was Governor Angus King. All along, it feels as if there's like a suppressed terror and panic lurking beneath the surface of the rants and hatreds. There was a particular question that James Baldwin loathed. And the question was, what does the Negro want? He wrote, quote, "The question betrays a flight from reality, which is absolutely unimaginable if we were not dealing with what in the public mind is a quote unquote Negro. The question would never be asked." He says, anyone who asks, what does the Negro want, is saying in another way that he is afraid of change, end quote. Black folk, people of color, are often seen as wholly other, that our desires and aspirations are not quite the same as our white fellows. In other words, the question emanates from a host of assumptions that set us apart from the rest of humanity. Because if you thought of us as human beings like you, think of yourselves, you would understand what we want. It would be easily answerable. We want what any human being wants in this regard: the opportunity to make our dreams a reality. But all too often, racial justice or quests for diversity and equity become philanthropic enterprises, charitable gestures that are often heated up in moments of crises. We treat the issue as we do a pet project and the people as objects of concern. And in those moments of crisis, we try to change all at once. And when we tire of it all, we turn our attention elsewhere because we never believed racial inequality was constitutive of who we take ourselves to be. Now, in his essay, The Price of the Ticket, written as an introduction to his collected works, Baldwin insisted that we have to reimagine ourselves. As he put it, quote, "In the church I come from, we were counseled from time to time to do our first works over." I think this comes from the second chapter of Revelations, verse 5, to do one's first works over. And Baldwin goes on to say, to do your first works over means to re-examine everything, to go back to where you started or as far back as you can, to examine all of it, to travel your road again and tell the truth about it. Sing or shout or testify or keep it to yourself, but know whence you came. Know from whence you came. To do your first works over. I remember when we first had our son, who's now a grown man, off doing a law degree at Berkeley Law School in California. But I remember when he was born, I knew that I had to deal with my father's sins in relation to me, so that I would not become my father in relation to my son. I had to go back and do my own first works overs. I had to go back and understand what shaped me, because I didn't want to pass it on to my own child. If I didn't go back and reassess how I was raised, I would duplicate, I would reproduce all of that dysfunction. And you know what I did? End up doing some of it. To do one's first works over is to go back and look at the choices. What does it mean that we chose to compromise the revolution with the institution of slavery? What does it mean that in the moment after we left blood on the battlefield, according in the Civil War, introduced modern warfare to the world, and then we try to engage in building a genuinely multiracial democracy, and then what do we get? We get what? Jim Crow. We get the redemption. We get the lost cause. What does it mean that we chose to double down on our ugliness in this moment with convict leasing? What does it mean that we double down in this moment on the ideology of Anglo-Saxonism to go back and do our first works over? What does it mean in the context of the mid-20th century, where you had Black and brown folk and allies, right, fighting for what historians call the Second Reconstruction, aimed at fulfilling the broken promises of the first, clamoring for full citizenship rights. And what do we get in response? We get calls for law and order that laid the foundation for the carceral state and what I began my talk with tonight. We get calls for law and order. We get the tax revolt in California. We get the election of Richard Nixon twice. Right. And of course, we get the Hard Hat Rebellion in 1970. We get, the riots in Boston over busing. And then, of course, we get the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 to undo it all. What does it mean to go back and do one's first works over? To know from whence you came, to tell the truth about our journey to now. Thinking about the American philosopher George Santayana and his insight that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it, yes. And just with this in mind, that we have to do the hard work of a third founding, of giving birth to a new America. Now, again, this is hard work. And declarations of our inherent virtue don't take us very far in doing that work. Too many believe that this vision of racial equality, this vision of a just America is a zero-sum game that some will have to lose while others gain. Politicians play on this view. We have to reject this framing, though, because it is based on a view of scarcity that presupposes that advantage ought to accrue to a narrow group among us. We have to break the back of this view of if we are to imagine America anew, if we are to tell ourselves a different story. In short, we need an America where becoming white is no longer the price of the ticket. An America shorn of the belief that some, because of the color of their skin, should be valued more than others. An America, right, that will fundamentally imagine itself in the most robust terms. In 1962, I'm coming to a close. In 1962, James Baldwin published in the New York Times Book Review an essay entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. There he wrote, quote, "The effort to become a great novelist simply involves attempting to tell as much of the truth as one can bear, and then a little more," end quote. We must, as Jimmy put it, deal with what words hide and what they reveal. This is why this this exhibit is so important by the Maine Historical Society. Because it's all the more important, this insight that we deal with what our words hide and what they reveal. It's all the more important in a country like our own, where our stories often obscure the horrors of what we've done and ensure our innocence and inherent goodness. Telling the truth here, especially in dark times like our own, requires a certain kind of courage and commitment to shatter national illusions that offer safety and comfort. It involves risking it all in moments like these in order to release us into a new way of being together. This will entail at times a withering criticism of the past that haunts and constrains. It will entail at times a scathing critique of our own self-conception. Baldwin insisted that we ask the hard question: how shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? How shall we put ourselves in touch with reality? He understood, and I'm hoping you now understand, the pernicious effects of the lie on America's character, that the lie involves what we tell ourselves about Black and white people, that white people ought to be valued more than others in this country. And we've witnessed the monstrous consequences of what follows from this view in terms of our dispositions and practices. And in this moment of profound transition, in this moment of change, we see in real time the reassertion of the lie. We see it not just in declarations that we are not racist and in affirmations of American virtue, but in the debates around our history, the 1619 Project versus the 1776 Commission, the attack on so-called critical race theory in the classroom. We want our lies straight, no chaser, yes? Even in my home state of Mississippi, the Governor Tate Reeves, there threatens to remove funding for teaching the so-called lie of critical race theory, but declared the month of April Confederate Heritage Month. Declared April 26th Confederate Memorial Day. The lie of the lost cause lives. The trouble is deeper than we wish to think, because the trouble is in us. We are the serpents in the garden. As a nation, we stand on a knife's edge. The background conditions that make our democracy possible have cracked. We have to dare to be otherwise. You and I, have to dare to be otherwise. So how are you stepping up? What are you doing in this moment that requires of each of us acceptance and risk? We must accept who we are and risk being otherwise. And that requires telling ourselves a different story. It doesn't mean that we have to virtue signal or declare our liberal bona fides. I'm with Jimmy Baldwin on this one. I'm skeptical of people who want to do something for me. I want people to do something with me. I want us to build a new America together. How do we do this? We must risk everything to put the sin of racism behind us and figure out how to be together differently. At every moment in America's history, when we've had a chance to be otherwise, when we've had an opportunity to give birth to an America shorn of the value gap, of the belief in the value gap, the umbilical cord of white supremacy is wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out. We must risk everything to be better midwives. It's hard work. We have to tell the truth, uproot the value gap, enact a different way of being together in our daily lives, a way that emerges organically from the full diversity that gives this country life. In as much truth as one can bear, Baldwin wrote, quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced." Such powerful words for our country and for you and me. We cannot stick our heads in the sand this time. We cannot tinker around the edges this time. We cannot aspire for some symbolic unity and leave the old frame intact. The costs will be too high. We must shake loose from the shibboleths of the past and their gods and begin again. We must do our first works over, remembering that no matter what has been done, no matter the death that shadows our steps, we cannot turn away from our responsibility. We must grow up. And as Baldwin put it in his last novel, Just Above My Head, quote, responsibility isn't lost, it's abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, one begins again. In order to do this, we all must show up and risk ourselves in this moment. Tell a different story. Thank you, Maine Historical Society, for trying to do just that. And who knows, we might get it right this time. Take care. Looking forward to the conversation.
Eddie, thank you so much. That was such a powerful walk through history and look into ourselves. The way you wrapped up your comments, the word that's coming to mind, is agency, and I think that individually and collectively, So I see this. So I think one of the things our individuals grapple with is the role that they can play. And I think, as you've articulated and the exhibit tries to support, the first step is to look into ourselves and our own assumptions, understandings of our own experiences and where we fit into the world. But I also think there's a sense of helplessness. You see these national trends and stories and our inability to get out of our own way. So after introspection and after kind of confronting and looking, do you have thoughts, comments on how people can actively engage and take that introspection from a kind of an intellectual self-searching exercise into one that becomes action in their lives? Because I think people often feel helpless or powerless to know how they dig in and contribute to change. Do you have thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's really important. I think often what we have to do is get clear on our conceptions of justice, right? If we think that no one should go broke because they're sick, then we should be fighting for a healthcare system that reflects that value. If we think that if you're working 40 hours a week, you should be able to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head, then you should be fighting for a living wage. If you believe that everyone should be treated equally under the law, right, and that bias should not enter into sentencing, should not enter into policing, then you should be fighting for criminal justice and police reform. So in other words, we need to get clear on our conception of justice and get clear on why we're willing to be okay with exceptions vis-a-vis these things. And so once we're clear on our conception of justice, then we can identify right in our communities where those injustices evidence themselves. If you believe that every child, no matter their zip code, should have a decent education, that it shouldn't just be students who, communities around Bowdoin or communities around Bates or communities around Kobe that have decent schools, but all of Maine should have decent schools, right? Then you're supposed to be fighting for it. If you believe that your community should offer jobs that people can actually have a sustained way of, let me say it differently, that should be able to not only dream dreams, but in order to pass those dreams on to their children, right? Then you're supposed to be fighting for it. But we're constantly finding ourselves in these moments conceding to the exception. This is what Heather McGhee says in her book, The Sum of Us. She uses this wonderful analogy. I'm gonna just really quickly, this wonderful analogy. She uses the analogy of public swimming pools, right? In the mid 20th century. And the public swimming pool was designed as this democratic experiment, right? Where these ethnic enclaves where people were hauled off in their separate spaces, speaking their own languages, right? They would come out, don their swimming trunks, and American democracy would take shape in this public experience of the pool. But the moment Black people demanded access to those pools, the state took it away from everybody. They filled it up with concrete. They put grass over it, right? They said, before we share it with you, we will not have it. So it's called that zero-sum approach. If you have a conception of justice that includes all of these things, and you're clear on it, and you're clear on how you've been complicit with the exception, then you have to choose within your community how to align those commitments with where the fight is, right? Without the exceptions, you see. I don't need to tell you what to do. You know it if you're actually true, if you're actually clear about your conception of justice. You see the move I'm making?
Yeah.
And I think that's really important for us, because I think we're in a moment right now where we would rather throw American democracy into the trash bin, at least some of us, than concede to the fact that we are becoming a genuinely multiracial democracy.
So it's name it, see it, call it, but it's political and it's local and it's get active, you know. So the exception, I think the exception concept is really powerful because it's easy to compartmentalize and see all these right things, all these good things, all these things I'm proud of myself for. But when you have that exception, it dirties the pool and it ruins the whole. So you got to name it and take action.
Exactly.
Yeah. So to step up, so that's just, you know, one way of looking at the individual. So stepping back, you're an observer, you know, we're all in and out of this topic and we're reading the headlines and we're following and we're getting consumed by our work and we're back in and out. You're almost professionally engaged in where this nation is going and how we're getting there. Where do you see, given these trends, and in the book, you know, you talk about what happened after the voting rights with Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King. Where do you see the opportunities and hope of this moment today in 2021 because of this mobilized and energy, which we know has slid back before, but seems keyed in? Where do you see hope and opportunity?
Well, you know, I always, you know, Baldwin said this, let me say it this way. Baldwin said in 1970 in an interview that hope is invented every day. And, you know, it's a powerful formulation, but it's a formulation that presupposes something. That if you have to invent hope every day, that means you have to hold off despair every day, right? So my faith is in the capacity of human beings to be otherwise. My faith is in us. But I recognize, as Baldwin did, that we are at once miracles and disasters, right? That we have to protect ourselves from the disasters that we are. But if we show up, you know, there's at least a chance for a miracle. So I don't know where we're going to end up in this moment. If we are attentive to our history and we're attentive to some of the current debates, we already see this, you know, elements of the status quo trying to secure its privilege. I don't know where we're going to end up, but I do know that there is this kind of generalized sense that America is broken. And I say that without, you know, with understanding that this is not a good thing, right? But Gen Zers and millennials, they have grown up in kind of cascading catastrophes, right? I mean, one after the other, whether it's the recession of 2000, the Great Recession, whether it's school murders, where it's, you know, mass killings, whether it's 100-year storms that are happening every other year, you know, the Great Recession, a pandemic. They've come of age in a sense where the country where greed has overwhelmed the public, any conception of the public good. They know that the place is broken. They're reaching for different kinds of languages to make sense of the moment. Some are reaching for progressive languages, but others are reaching for old languages. The Boogaloo Boys aren't baby boomers. Dylan Roof isn't a baby boomer. So they're reaching for fascist languages in order to account for the moment. So where do I find hope in the midst of what I've just described, right? In the crisis. Every crisis is at once a moment of possibility. That once we see the cracks, there's an opportunity to imagine ourselves otherwise, and we have to stand in the breach. So my faith is in us, but I understand that history informs and shapes the very ways in which we act. So I'm not naive that there's guarantee that we're going to be otherwise on the other end of this, if that makes sense.
One of the simplest things, and this is a point I get from my wife frequently in our marriage, is the importance of acknowledgement. And the simple acknowledgement of who we are and how we've come to this place can go a long, long way. And which is why I think, looking deeply at our personal histories and these collective histories is so important, because I think there's a lot of blind spots and lack of awareness. It was really this way in Maine. Tell me more. This wealth was connected to that, to slavery. And so I think even that simple act of acknowledgement is so powerful, and it brings those of us who are willing to be in that space together in ways, just creates that environment where you can rebuild and start over.
Well, it's a basic Emersonian insight, right? Emersonian perfectionism has at its root an acknowledgement. If you don't acknowledge the self that you are, you can't leave it behind. So if I don't accept who I am, if you don't accept that you're wrong in the midst of the argument with your wife, if you refuse to accept it, then you can't get beyond it.
That's right.
It will continue to fester in some ways. So part of the acknowledgement is not about self-flagellation. It's not about a kind of demonstration of guilt, right? It's really about accepting who we are in order to release ourselves into a possibility of being otherwise. So whatever you think about the 1619 project at the level of fact or detail, when I tell my students about it, I say, oh, you should go read Toni Morrison's novel of Mercy. It will help give you a sense of how fluid this period actually is. But what is the 1619 project? It is simply a beginning, right? Edward Said in his book Beginning says the problems of beginning is the beginning of the problem. Where you start matters. So if we decided to tell the story of America from 1619, well, what comes into view? Well, first, America was a corporation before it was a country. Fascinating. What else? Well, they're native peoples that are critical. You can't tell the story of Maine without, telling the story of native peoples and their presence and why they're absent, right? Native peoples, indentured servitude, slavery, but also failure, right? But you can tell the story, the beginning of America, whether you choose 1619, 1776, 1865, or 1965, right? What you're doing is bringing certain things into view. You have to acknowledge, accept, in order to imagine yourself otherwise, it seems to me.
Going back to, you were talking about the future and young people. One of the questions we received was, and as an educator and somebody who has taught in Maine, you'll have perspectives. The question we get is, teacher in a very homogenous community in Maine, bringing them to awareness and into this topic. Do you have any kind of guidance, advice to help stimulate these conversations about race in these homogenous schools?
Sure, I think it's really about what might be called a contrapuntal reading. What does it mean to read the Declaration of Independence alongside of David Walker's appeal, right? 1829, right? Because notes of David Walker's appeal is a direct response to Jefferson's notes, right? What does it mean to create these kinds of conditions under which, or these encounters within the syllabus, right? That reveal the history is much more complicated than the story we tell ourselves. What does it mean to read Toni Morrison's Beloved? What does it mean to encounter Frederick Douglass's narratives? What does it mean to read, more than just simply the letters from the Birmingham jail, but to really kind of bring the fullness of the history into the classroom? And that's just the African American side, right? Part of what I'm trying to suggest here is that it's not about just homogeneous communities or homogenous communities, right? It's really about how do we offer, right, how do we widen the aperture so that our students can see the various complexities of the history that shapes them? And I think any teacher worth her salt should try to do that. But look, I'm a product of Mississippi schools. I found myself growing up in middle school One of my favorite general in the Civil War was Stonewall Jackson. What the hell? You see?
I'm still reeling from your comment 15 minutes ago about the Confederate memorial, whatever the day that's
Yes.
officially instituted. Yeah.
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 Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, where was I? I was just going to go some. Okay, I want to go to one of the questions. I'm going to read from it just to get it right. And so it kind of has to do with your use of the words "we" and "us." Okay, so the question is, Dr. Glaude, in your book and in this talk tonight, we're struck by your use of the words "we" and "us." Feels generous, but also it's a reminder of the poison we're accustomed to hearing in conversation across differences. Would you say a "we" that includes us all is aspirational, the we, or perhaps we just don't usually live up to the truth of us?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a wonderful question. Baldwin's we is always ambiguous. In one moment, if you read Many Thousands Gone, he's actually occupying the voice of white people. So the we could be white America, the we could be Black America, the we can be aspirational. And so what I tend to do is play on our we's. And the idea is to give us a sense of how inextricably connected we all are, right? So there are moments in the book where the we is obviously Black folk. And then there are other moments where the we is America as such. And then the other moments, the we is me kind of parroting the voice of white America, those who are committed. So it requires a kind of keeping track of, but at the end of the day, my we is always aspiration. It's rooted in this claim that we have to figure out a different way of being together. This sense of mutuality, which is at the heart of my conception of democracy. All right.
You know, that's interesting too, because I think to me, the most powerful tool to the path forward is this sense of recognizing and understanding and exploring the universals that pull us all together, that define us. You know, the fact that every human's life is defined by a search for opportunity, for security, for raising children, for taking care of elderly parents, and trying to make a living, and just trying to find a little safe niche in the world. And that to me is the great universal that every human being experiences. So when you're talking about reading Toni Morrison or name any other literary figure or history, it's that ability to put yourself in the shoes. And it gets back to what you were saying about exceptions before. You know, would you allow that exception if it's your sister or your cousin or somebody who was, you know, experiencing it that? So I think that's the power of what we can strive for. And I hope what our exhibit will help to do in our approach to history is just finding how much we all share. And once you feel like, oh, me too, you know, that, you know, I share that anxiety or that sense of, which makes me act, you know, react in a certain way, you know?
Right. I mean, you think about this in the case when you have an ongoing discourse that dehumanizes people, that renders them right, renders them invisible because you're trafficking instead in stereotypes. It can lead to the justification of locking up millions of people and throwing away the key. Just think about the different response to the epidemic of crack and the epidemic to the opioid crisis. And it has everything to do with who's addicted, right? And it has everything to do with whose life we think is more valuable. There's sympathy, there's empathy, right? There's the view that there's a sickness here. Over here, with regards to crack, these are monsters who have no moral center. They're super predators, right? And so part of what happens when we allow stereotypes to traffic or to stand in for the actual human beings, we deepen the mystery between us. All of us have two things that are every human being have two significant moments, two significant breaths. Every one of us, no matter our differences, two significant breaths, the first one and the last one. And the question is, what are we going to do in between them? But we're all common, we're all joined at the hip by those two significant breaths, right? And so I think you're absolutely right, man. When we can get beyond these assumptions about who we are and get to know the human being right in front of us. Right? But we're mysteries to each other.
Indeed, indeed. Let me just I want to just take a quick look and make sure I'm not
Sure.
missing any questions out here.
I saw a couple there. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Clearly I'm not, speedy on the MC or the technology. Yeah, another comment about the importance of acknowledging who we are, which begins with who we have been. We go past that as fast as we can. If we can get that, in my opinion, only when we can do that, we can move forward and get to the idea for justice for all. Yeah, I think to me, the power in all this, or the point in all this, is how do we move forward together? And creating, you look to the words of our founding documents and the principles, and in our faith documents, and what we aspire to. But it's about clearing the decks and making that acknowledgement so we can join together and say, what do we want Maine to look like? We're just come out of Maine's bicentennial. We're heading into our 3rd century. What do we want it to look like? What do we want it to be? And what's going to drive us forward? So I think what's so important about this acknowledgement is bringing everybody in, everybody who is here in Maine, and having them have a stake in the future and us creating it together.
Right. I mean, that's the beauty of the quilt art of old Black slave women, right? There is something about that story that we can tell ourselves, a story that allows for a sense of mutuality that connects one to the other, where we're all a part of the central fabric of this place. And this is why the exhibit is so important at MHS. Right, it's this effort to tell a different kind of story, right? And we understand that the story is ongoing, that we're gonna be revising it, but it's a story that allows us to be expansive in our self-conception and loving in our practice. That's the key, it seems to me.
I think that's a quote that's a good quote to end on. And I'm actually going to read a comment we had from a person because I think it's a nice kind of thing. It says, "Thank you. So wonderful to hear you say what she has felt in her heart and have hoped for all of her almost 74 years. The time is now." So I think that's a really nice way. So thank you for that comment, Dina. Yeah. Dr. Glaude, I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. Again, I know you're running around like crazy at the end of the school year, all of your work and all your great commitments. So we really appreciate taking the time to help us sort through these things, figuring out where we fit in. We really, really appreciate it. To all our guests out there, thank you so much for listening and caring about Maine and wanting to be part of the solution and moving things forward. The exhibit opens next Thursday, the 27th. But, one of the great things about, I don't say about the pandemic, but about Zoom is this ability it opens up for us to be talking across geography and space and participating regardless of where we are. I think we've got a tremendous program series. We've been doing lots of programs that you can find on our website that have touched on some of these topics that you can go and listen to now, but please stay tuned. Next week, we got a wonderful talk with Edward Ball, who is a historian who has looked at the own legacies within his family and in his books, and it's a really interesting look. His family were slaveholders. They were members of the Klan, and he tried to grapple with where does that, how does he acknowledge and reckon with that? So anyway, there's some lively discussions. We appreciate you all being part of it. Dr. Glaude, thanks. I hope you can get up to Maine, post-pandemic Maine soon or this summer or before long. Please stop by if you do.
I have to go see some great lighthouses, right? Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you all for participating. Take care. Good night.
Take care.